On a rain-soaked afternoon in 1882, a heavily pregnant woman and her 2 young children pulled a drowning stranger from the Red River. What Clara Mae didn't know was that she had just saved the life of Colt Langston, heir to the largest cattle fortune in the territory. Clara was 8 months along and barely keeping her late husband's ranch from foreclosure when she spotted the rider being swept away by the flooding waters. Despite her condition, she and her twin children, Samuel and Sarah, managed to drag the unconscious man to shore. As Colt recovered in her modest cabin, he learned the depth of Clara's struggle-crushing debts, an unforgiving banker, and winter approaching with little food stored. Bound by honor and growing affection for the brave woman who saved his life, Colt made a promise that would change everything. But his family's enemies were closing in, and helping Clara meant putting her and the children directly in their crosshairs. Would love be enough to overcome the dangers that followed the Langston name? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the threadbare curtains of Clara Mae's cabin, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor where her late husband's ledger lay open. Each page told the same story, another failed venture, another unpaid debt, another dream that had withered like the crops during last summer's drought. Thomas had been a good man, gentle with her and loving with the twins, but he'd possessed the kind of optimism that saw opportunity where wiser men saw folly. Clara traced her finger down the column of numbers, her other hand resting on the swell of her belly where the baby stirred restlessly. 8 months along, and she could barely manage the daily chores that kept the small ranch functioning. The chickens still needed feeding, the milk cow required tending, and the vegetable garden demanded constant attention to yield enough to see them through the approaching winter. "Mama, the man's awake," Sarah announced from the doorway, her 7-year-old voice carrying a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Clara closed the ledger with a soft thud, the sound somehow final in the quiet cabin. 3 days had passed since they'd pulled the stranger from the Red River, 3 days of nursing him through fever and watching over his unconscious form. She'd tended to his wounds, a nasty gash on his forehead, bruised ribs, and scraped hands with the same careful attention she'd once given her own children when they fell from trees or stumbled in the barn. The twins had been fascinated by their unexpected guest. Samuel, practical like his father had been, worried aloud about having another mouth to feed. Sarah, with her mother's compassionate heart, had insisted they share their meager portions to help the stranger regain his strength. Both children had spent hours sitting beside his makeshift bed, whispering stories and asking questions he couldn't answer in his fevered state. Clara rose slowly, her hand pressed against her lower back where the constant ache had settled. The baby seemed to grow heavier each day, and she found herself moving with the careful deliberation of someone carrying precious cargo. She smoothed her worn calico dress-on of only 2 that still fit her changing figure and made her way to the small room where they'd placed their patient. He was sitting up against the rough-hewn headboard, his dark hair tousled and his eyes alert for the first time since his rescue. Those eyes, a deep brown, flecked with gold, took in the sparse room with its simple furnishings and faded quilt. When his gaze settled on Clara, she saw intelligence there, and something else that made her heart skip unexpectedly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse, but carrying the refined accent of education and breeding, "I believe I owe you my life." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. It had been so long since any man besides old Doc Henderson had looked at her with such direct attention. "You owe me nothing, mister. Any decent person would have done the same. Not many decent people would risk themselves for a stranger, especially in your condition." His eyes dropped briefly to her rounded belly before returning to her face with respectful attention. "Your children told me you all pulled me from the river. That took considerable courage." Samuel appeared beside his mother, his small frame radiating the protective instinct that had emerged since his father's death. At 7, he'd appointed himself the man of the house, a responsibility that sat heavily on his narrow shoulders. "Mama's the bravest person in the whole territory," he declared with fierce loyalty. The stranger's mouth curved in what Clara supposed was meant to be a smile, though it seemed to cause him some discomfort. "I don't doubt that for a moment, son. What's your name?" "Samuel Thompson, and this is my sister Sarah." The boy gestured toward his twin, who lingered in the doorway with uncharacteristic shyness. "Our papa died last spring, and now it's just us and Mama and the baby that's coming." Clara felt the familiar tightness in her chest at Samuel's matter-of-fact recitation of their circumstances. The children had learned too young that life could change in an instant, that security was as fragile as morning frost. "I'm sorry for your loss," the stranger said quietly, and Clara heard genuine sympathy in his voice. "Your father was fortunate to have such a fine family." "What's your name, mister?" Sarah ventured from the doorway, her curiosity finally overcoming her reserve. The man was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting between the children and Clara. Something flickered across his features as a brief shadow that spoke of complicated truths. "Colt," he said finally, "Colt Langston." The name meant nothing to Clara, but she noticed how he said it, as if it carried weight he wasn't entirely comfortable bearing. "Well, Mr. Langston, you're welcome to stay until you're strong enough to travel, though I'm afraid our hospitality is somewhat limited." Colt's eyes moved around the cabin, taking in details Clara had long since stopped noticing: the carefully mended furniture, the scrubbed but worn surfaces, the way every item spoke of making do with less. His gaze lingered on Thomas's ledger where it lay on the small table, its pages still fanned open to reveal columns of debt. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, then paused. "It is Mrs., isn't it?" "It is. Clara Mae Thompson." She lifted her chin slightly, a gesture that had become second nature when speaking with the men in town who seemed to think widowhood made her either pitiful or available. "Mrs. Thompson, I wonder if I might ask what happened to your husband. The children mentioned it was recent." Clara's hand moved instinctively to the simple gold band on her finger, Thomas's final gift to her. The wedding ring had become more than jewelry. It was armor against a world that had little patience for women trying to make their own way. Thomas took sick last spring. Started with a cough that wouldn't go away, and by summer's end, she let the words trail off, unwilling to revisit those final difficult weeks. "I'm truly sorry. It must be challenging managing everything alone." The understatement almost made Clara laugh, though she found no humor in their situation. Challenging hardly covered the daily struggle to keep food on the table, the animals fed, and the bank from seizing what little they had left. "We manage," she said simply. Colt shifted against the headboard, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured ribs. "Mrs. Thompson, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I couldn't help noticing your husband's business records. If you're facing financial difficulties—" "That's none of your concern, Mr. Langston." Clara's voice carried a sharp edge that made both children look up in surprise. She rarely spoke harshly, but something about this stranger's perceptive gaze made her feel exposed, vulnerable in a way she couldn't afford. "Of course not. I meant no offense." Colt's tone remained respectful, but Clara caught the subtle shift in his posture that suggested he was accustomed to being heard, perhaps even obeyed. "I was merely thinking that someone who saved my life deserves better than whatever hardship she's facing." Clara felt the baby kick strongly, as if responding to her elevated pulse. She placed both hands on her belly, using the moment to gather her composure. This man, whoever he truly was, had stumbled into their lives at a time when she could least afford complications. Yet something about his presence in their modest cabin felt significant, as if the current that had nearly claimed his life had also carried him here for reasons beyond mere chance. "Mr. Langston," she said carefully, "I appreciate your gratitude, but we don't need charity. We've been managing just fine on our own." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Just that morning, she'd counted their remaining supplies and realized they had perhaps 3 weeks of food left. The vegetable garden had yielded well, but winter was coming, and the small amount of money Thomas had left wouldn't stretch to cover both food and the mortgage payment due in 6 weeks. Colt studied her face with the kind of attention that suggested he saw through her carefully maintained facade. Of course, I didn't mean to imply otherwise, but perhaps, while I recover, I could help with some of the heavier work around the place. Consider it part of repaying the debt I owe you." Samuel's eyes lit up with interest. "Can you fix fences, mister? Our north pasture fence got knocked down in the storm last month, and Mama can't lift the posts by herself." "Samuel," Clara warned. But the boy continued with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been carrying adult responsibilities for too long. "And the roof leaks something fierce when it rains hard, and the milk cow's been getting out because the gate don't latch proper anymore." Clara felt heat climb her neck as her son catalogued their various needs with the brutal honesty of childhood. Each item he mentioned represented another task she couldn't manage alone, another reminder of how desperately they needed help she couldn't afford to accept. "I know my way around a ranch," Colt said quietly. "If you'll have me, I'd be grateful for the chance to work off my debt to you." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Clara didn't dare examine too closely. She looked at this stranger, who'd washed up on their doorstep like something the river had decided to return. This man, whose refined speech and careful manners suggested a background far removed from their humble circumstances. "We'll see how you mend first," she said finally, the compromise feeling safer than either acceptance or refusal. "Right now, you need rest and proper food to get your strength back." As if summoned by her words, the aroma of cornbread drifted from the kitchen where she'd left it baking. Clara excused herself to tend to their meal, grateful for a reason to escape Colt Langston's too perceptive gaze. As she pulled the golden bread from the oven, she could hear the low murmur of his voice talking with the children, answering their questions with the patient attention their father would have given. The baby shifted restlessly in her womb, and Clara pressed her hand against the movement, wondering what kind of world she was bringing this child into. Thomas had left them with debts and dreams in equal measure, and now a stranger had appeared who might be either salvation or complication. Standing in her small kitchen, surrounded by the familiar rhythms of daily life, Clara Mae Thompson couldn't know that her act of mercy had set in motion events that would transform all their lives forever. 3 days later, as Clara hung laundry behind the cabin while the twins played in the yard, she noticed Colt examining something in his palm. The morning sun caught the glint of metal as he turned the object over in his fingers, his expression troubled. "Mr. Langston," she called, draping one of Samuel's shirts over the line. "Is everything all right?" He looked up, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Mrs. Thompson, there's something I need to tell you about who I am." Clara felt her stomach tighten. She'd sensed secrets in the man from the beginning, his refined speech, his soft hands that spoke of a life without calluses, the way he carried himself despite his injuries. "Go on." Colt held up the object he'd been studying. Even from a distance, Clara could see it was a ring, heavy and ornate. "This is my family's signet ring. It bears the Langston cattle brand." He paused, watching her face. "My father owns the largest ranch in 3 territories, 50,000 head of cattle, more land than some eastern states." The laundry basket slipped from Clara's hands, scattering damp clothes across the ground. She'd heard whispers about the Langston Empire. Everyone in the territory had. They were spoken of in the same breath as railroad barons and mining magnates, men whose wealth and influence stretched far beyond the frontier. "You're one of those Langstons," she said quietly, bending to retrieve the fallen laundry. The simple gold wedding band on her finger seemed to mock her as she thought of the gulf between their worlds. "I'm afraid so." Colt's voice carried a weight that suggested his family name was more burden than blessing. "Which is why I need to explain why I was in that river, and why helping me might bring trouble to your door." Samuel and Sarah had stopped their game, sensing the shift in the adults' conversation. They drew closer to their mother, flanking her like small sentinels. Clara straightened, one hand pressed to her aching back, and studied the man who had disrupted their quiet desperation. "I'm listening." Colt pocketed the ring and moved closer, his movements still careful but stronger than they'd been days before. My father is dying, has been for months, though he's too stubborn to admit it. The family's been discussing succession. Discussing? Fighting would be more accurate. My older brother Marcus believes the entire empire should pass to him. He's got the support of most of our business partners and half our ranch hands. He's also got men who aren't particular about their methods. Clara felt the baby stir restlessly, as if sensing her growing tension. And you disagree with this arrangement? I want nothing to do with any of it. The vehemence in Colt's voice surprised her. I've seen what that kind of power does to men, Mrs. Thompson. My father built his empire by crushing smaller ranchers, by buying politicians and judges, by treating people like obstacles to be removed. Marcus is worse. He sees opportunity in every tragedy, profit in every neighbor's misfortune. So you ran away? Sarah asked, her 7-year-old directness cutting through the adult complications. Colt's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. Something like that, sweetheart. I was riding to meet with a lawyer in Austin, trying to find a way to legally separate myself from the family business. Marcus's men caught wind of it and decided to discourage me. They tried to kill you, Samuel said matter-of-factly. They tried to make it look like an accident, a man alone on the trail, thrown from his horse during a storm. These things happen. Colt's hand moved unconsciously to his ribs. If you hadn't pulled me from that river, they would have succeeded. Clara sank onto the wooden step, her legs suddenly unsteady. She'd saved this man's life, pulled him from the water out of simple human decency, and now learned she'd interfered in the affairs of one of the territory's most powerful families. Men who, according to Colt, weren't above murder to protect their interests. What does this mean for us? She asked quietly. It means Marcus will be looking for me. When he finds out I survived, he'll come here. Colt's expression was grave. I can't stay, Mrs. Thompson. I won't bring that kind of danger to you and your children. The words should have brought relief. Instead, Clara felt something twist in her chest, a sensation she'd buried since Thomas's death. In the few days since his rescue, Colt Langston had become more than just a patient recovering in their spare room. He'd fixed the loose gate on the chicken coop, helped Samuel with his arithmetic, and listened to Sarah's endless stories with patient attention. The children looked at him with something approaching hero worship, and Clara herself had begun to look forward to his presence at their modest dinner table. But you said, Sarah's voice was small, confused, you said you could help fix our fence. The innocence in her daughter's words cut deeper than any dramatic declaration could have. Sarah had latched onto the promise of help, the rare presence of a man who treated her with gentle respect. Samuel, too, had begun to straighten his shoulders, to speak with less of the worried weight he'd carried since becoming the man of the house at 7 years old. I wish I could, sweetheart, but sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult choices to keep the people they care about safe. Clara found herself speaking before she'd fully formed the thought. What if we don't want to be kept safe? What if we want to make our own choices? Colt's eyes snapped to hers, searching her face. Mrs. Thompson, you don't understand what you'd be facing. Marcus has resources, men who what? Who think they can ride onto my land and threaten my family? Clara stood, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. Mr. Langston, I've been threatened by the bank, by creditors, by neighbors who think a woman alone is easy prey. I'm still here. This is different. Marcus won't be content with foreclosure papers or whispered gossip. He'll what? Kill a pregnant woman and her children? Clara's voice rose. In front of half the territory, even powerful men have to answer for some things. Colt was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her aware of her faded dress, her work-worn hands, the precarious nature of everything she was defending. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but certain. You're braver than you have any right to be, Clara Mae Thompson. The use of her full name, spoken with such quiet reverence, sent warmth through her chest. It had been so long since anyone had seen her as more than a problem to be solved or an obligation to be managed. I'm desperate, she corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I stand, It looks like courage. "Mama," Samuel said quietly, "if the bad men come, can we hide in the root cellar like Papa showed us?" The question broke Clara's heart and strengthened her resolve in equal measure. Her children had already lost their father, had already learned too young that the world could be cruel and unpredictable. She wouldn't let them learn that good people ran away when times got difficult. "We won't be hiding, Samuel. This is our home, and we have every right to be here." "But Mrs. Thompson," Colt pressed, "if Marcus finds me here, he'll assume you're helping me out of more than just Christian charity. He'll see you as an ally, and that makes you a threat. Then perhaps we should make sure I'm worth the concern." Clara's chin lifted with the stubborn pride that had carried her through widowhood and poverty. "You said your father built his empire by crushing smaller ranchers. How many of those ranchers were trying to protect their families just like us?" "Too many." "And how many of them had someone willing to stand with them?" Colt's expression shifted, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Not enough." "Well then," Clara brushed dust from her skirts and straightened her shoulders, "it seems to me you have a choice, Mr. Langston. You can run away and let your brother win by default, or you can stand and fight for something worth protecting. And if I stay, if I bring that fight to your doorstep..." Clara looked at her children, at the small cabin that represented everything she had left of her life with Thomas, at the vast sky that promised both storms and clear days ahead. The baby moved restlessly beneath her heart, this new life that deserved a chance to grow up in a world where right mattered more than might. "Then we fight together," she said simply, "because some things are worth the risk." The signet ring in Colt's pocket seemed to pulse with the weight of generations, of power and responsibility he'd tried to escape. But looking at Clara Thompson fierce, determined, 8 months pregnant, and ready to face down an empire for the sake of what was right, realized he'd been running from the wrong thing. The question wasn't whether he could escape his family's legacy. The question was whether he could forge a new one, here in this place where a woman's courage had already begun to change everything. By the end of the week, Colt had proven his worth around the Thompson ranch in ways that went far beyond mere gratitude. Despite his healing ribs, he'd managed to repair the north pasture fence that had confounded Clara for months, fashion a proper latch for the milk cow's gate, and shore up the weakest section of the cabin's roof before the next storm could find its way inside. Samuel had appointed himself Colt's shadow, following the man around with wide-eyed attention as he worked. The boy's small hands proved surprisingly capable when given proper guidance, and Clara often found herself pausing in her own tasks to watch her son's face light up with pride as he helped hold boards or fetch tools. The wooden horse Thomas had carved for Samuel sat forgotten on the boy's shelf, replaced by the more immediate pleasure of learning grown-up skills from someone who had infinite patience for a 7-year-old's questions. Clara felt a pang watching Samuel bloom under Colt's attention, realizing how much her son had missed having a man's steady presence in his daily life. "Mama, look what Colt taught me!" Samuel burst through the cabin door, his small hands carefully cradling something wrapped in cloth. "He showed me how to whittle without cutting myself." Clara set down her mending and accepted the bundle, unwrapping it to reveal a small wooden bird, rough-hewn but recognizable. The craftsmanship wasn't as fine as Thomas's work had been, but the pride in Samuel's eyes made it precious beyond measure. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. What kind of bird is it?" "A mockingbird, like the ones that sing in the morning." Colt says mockingbirds are special because they can sing any song they hear, but they're still themselves underneath. Samuel's brow furrowed with the seriousness of someone working through a complex idea. He says sometimes people are like mockingbirds too. The observation was too sophisticated for a 7-year-old to have reached alone, and Clara found herself wondering what conversations had passed between her son and their guest while she'd been occupied with household tasks. There was something both touching and concerning about the bond forming between them, touching because Samuel needed masculine guidance, concerning because Colt's presence in their lives remained temporary by necessity. "Where is Colt now?" she asked, settling back into her chair and picking up her sewing. "Talking to Sarah by the well. She's telling him about Papa's stories." Samuel climbed onto the chair beside his mother, his small hands still bearing traces of wood shavings. "Mama, is Colt going to stay with us?" The question Clara had been dreading arrived with the straightforward innocence she should have expected. Samuel had lost his father barely 6 months ago. Of course he would grasp onto the first man who showed him kindness and attention. "I don't know, sweetheart. Colt has complicated things in his own life that he needs to sort through. But he likes us, doesn't he? And we like him. Sometimes liking someone isn't enough to make them stay." The words came out more bitter than Clara intended, colored by memories of watching Thomas waste away despite all her love and determination to keep him with them. Samuel studied her face with the unsettling perceptiveness children sometimes displayed. "Are you scared he'll leave like Papa did?" The directness of the question took Clara's breath away. She set down her needle and pulled Samuel closer, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair mixed with the outdoor smells of his afternoon's work. "Papa didn't choose to leave us, Samuel. He got sick, and sometimes people can't get better no matter how much we want them to. But Colt could choose to stay if he wanted to, couldn't he?" Before Clara could formulate an answer that was both honest and age-appropriate, the cabin door opened again. Sarah slipped inside, her usually animated expression subdued. "Mama, there are men riding up the road." Clara felt ice settle in her stomach. She moved to the window, Samuel still pressed against her side, and peered through the glass. 3 riders approached in the distance, their pace deliberate rather than urgent. Even from far away, there was something about their bearing that suggested they weren't neighbors paying a social call. "Sarah, go find Colt. Tell him we have visitors." Clara's voice remained calm, despite the fear clawing at her throat. "Samuel, I want you to take your sister and go to your room. Stay there until I come get you." "But Mama—" "Now, Samuel." The children heard the authority in her tone and obeyed without further protest, though she caught Samuel peeking around the doorframe as she checked the load in Thomas's rifle. The weapon felt heavy and unfamiliar in her hands, but she'd learned to shoot during the lean months after Thomas's death, when putting meat on the table had become her responsibility. Colt appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Clara, you need to get the children and go to the root cellar, now. This is my home, and those are my children. I'm not hiding. These aren't neighbors coming to borrow sugar. If Marcus sent them, then they'll find out that the Thompson family doesn't intimidate easily." Clara's hands shook slightly as she gripped the rifle, but her voice remained steady. "How do we handle this?" Colt stared at her for a moment, something shifting in his expression. Then he nodded, accepting her decision with the respect she'd been craving from the men in her life. "We meet them outside, together. But Clara, let me do the talking." They walked out onto the small porch, presenting a united front to the approaching riders. Clara kept the rifle lowered but visible, while Colt stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between her and whatever threat approached. The 3 men who reined up in front of the cabin bore the unmistakable signs of Marcus Langston's employment, well-armed, well-mounted, and carrying themselves with the casual arrogance of men accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. The leader, a weathered man with cold eyes and a jagged scar across his left cheek, touched his hat brim in mock courtesy. "Ma'am, we're looking for someone who might have passed this way. Young man, dark hair, probably injured, goes by the name of Colt Langston." Clara felt Colt tense beside her, but she answered before he could speak. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, gentlemen. No one by that name has been here." The scarred man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now, ma'am, that's interesting, because we followed a trail from the river that led right to your door, and our employer is very concerned about his missing relative." "Your employer's concerns don't extend to my property." Clara's voice carried the quiet steel Thomas had always admired. "I suggest you continue your search elsewhere." "Ma'am, I think you're misunderstanding the situation." The leader dismounted, his companions following suit. "Mr. Marcus Langston is a very influential man in these parts. When he expresses concern about someone's welfare, Decent folks are usually eager to help, and I'm sure Mr. Langston appreciates their cooperation, but as I said, no one by that name has been here. Clara watched as the man's eyes moved over their modest homestead, the patched roof, the small garden, the general air of genteel poverty that clung to everything they owned. She could practically see him calculating their vulnerability, their isolation, their dependence on the goodwill of more powerful neighbors. Ma'am, lying to protect someone can be unhealthy, especially for a woman in your condition, with children to think about. The threat, delivered in conversational tones, made Clara's blood run cold. But before she could respond, Colt stepped forward, his entire demeanor changing. "That's enough." His voice carried an authority Clara hadn't heard before, the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to command. "You've delivered your message. Now get off this lady's property." The scarred man's eyes narrowed as he studied Colt more carefully. "Well, well, the prodigal son returns. Marcus has been worried sick about you, boy." "I'm sure he has. Give Marcus my regards and tell him I'm exactly where I choose to be." "He's not going to like that answer." "Then perhaps Marcus should learn to live with disappointment." Colt's hand moved casually to rest on the grip of the pistol at his hip. "The way I've had to." The tension stretched taut between the two groups, pregnant with the possibility of violence. Clara found herself calculating distance show. Quickly she could get to her children. Whether Thomas's rifle would be enough against 3 armed men. How many seconds they might have if this encounter turned deadly. Then the baby kicked, hard and insistent, and Clara gasped involuntarily. The sound seemed to break the spell, reminding everyone present that this confrontation involved more than just the adults who'd chosen their sides. The scarred man remounted his horse, but his eyes never left Colt's face. "This isn't over, boy. Marcus doesn't give up easy, and he's got a long memory. Tell Marcus that some things are worth the fight." Colt's voice carried quiet conviction, "and that running away and standing your ground aren't the same thing." The men rode away without further words, but Clara could feel their menace lingering in the air like smoke from a distant fire. When they were finally out of sight, she sank onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly unsteady. "Clara." Colt was beside her immediately, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Are you all right? Is it the baby?" "I'm fine, just processing." She looked up at him, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time since his rescue. That wasn't the behavior of a man running away from his responsibilities. Colt settled beside her on the step, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "You were magnificent, standing up to them like that, protecting your home." "Our home," Clara corrected quietly. "If you're staying." The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to examine. In the distance, a mockingbird began its evening song, cycling through the calls of a dozen other species while never losing its own essential nature. Inside the cabin, 2 children waited for the all-clear, clutching a hand-carved wooden horse and wondering if the adults in their lives would prove as reliable as the stories they'd been told about happy endings. That evening, after the children had been reassured and put to bed, Clara found herself sitting at the kitchen table across from Colt, her mother's locket open in her palm. The tiny photograph inside showed a young couple, formal and serious in the way people posed for cameras in those days, but with love evident in how they leaned toward each other. "My parents," she explained, noticing Colt's gentle interest. "They died when I was 16, cholera epidemic that swept through Kansas in '64. Colt studied the photograph with respectful attention. "You have your mother's eyes, and her strength, I imagine." Clara traced the worn silver of the locket's edge, remembering her mother's steady hands, her quiet determination during the hardest times. "She used to say that we don't choose our troubles, but we do choose how we face them. I think about that often these days." She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Practical, too. When the epidemic took my father first, she sat us children down and explained exactly what we were facing. No false comfort, no promises she couldn't keep. Just the truth, and her commitment to see us through whatever came. Clara closed the locket, but kept it cupped in her palm. I try to remember that with Samuel and Sarah. They deserve honesty, even when it's difficult. The conversation that had been building between them all day finally found its opening. Colt leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table between them. Clara, I need you to understand what you're agreeing to if I stay. Marcus isn't going to give up after one warning. He'll be back, and next time he'll bring more men and fewer pretenses about courtesy. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't just about standing up to bullies or protecting your land anymore. Marcus sees me as a threat to everything he's built his identity around. He won't stop until one of us is dead or destroyed. Clara felt the baby shift restlessly, responding to her elevated pulse. She placed her free hand on her belly, finding comfort in the life growing there. Tell me about your family. Help me understand what we're really facing. Colt was quiet for a long moment, gathering thoughts that seemed to pain him. The Langston Empire started with my grandfather, who came to Texas with nothing but ambition and a willingness to take what he wanted. He built the first ranch through a combination of legitimate deals and methods that wouldn't bear close examination. And your father continued the tradition? Expanded it, consolidated smaller ranches through foreclosure, bought influence with judges and politicians, eliminated competition through whatever means proved necessary. Colt's voice carried the weight of inherited shame. By the time Marcus and I came of age, the family controlled more land and cattle than some eastern robber barons controlled industry. Clara absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the gentleman who'd helped her children with whittling projects and the scion of a family built on ruthless acquisition. Where do you fit in all this? I was supposed to be the heir who legitimized everything. Educated, refined, acceptable to the Eastern investors and politicians, our expansion required. Colt's mouth twisted in something that wasn't quite a smile. Marcus was always the enforcer, the one who handled the unpleasant necessities. I was meant to be the acceptable face of the empire. But you refused. I tried to find middle ground for years, told myself I could reform things from the inside, make the family business more ethical. It was a comfortable lie. Clara heard the self-recrimination in his voice and recognized it. She'd told herself similar lies during Thomas's illness, convinced that if she just tried harder, loved more desperately, she could keep death from taking him. What changed your mind? Colt was quiet so long Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. There was a family, German immigrants who'd bought a section of land adjacent to one of our major holdings. Good people, hard-working, with 3 young children. Their well failed during the drought 2 summers ago, and they came to us asking to buy water for their livestock. Clara felt her stomach tighten, sensing the direction of the story. Marcus saw opportunity. He offered to buy their land at a fraction of its value, claiming it was worthless without water. When they refused, he made sure their other options disappeared. Cut off their credit in town, convinced their neighbors not to help, had their cattle scattered by night riders. And you? I stood by and watched. Told myself it was just business, that they could start over somewhere else. Even convinced myself we were doing them a favor by forcing them to face reality. The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared understanding of how good people could make terrible choices through incremental compromises. What happened to them? The father took sick from overwork and worry. Pneumonia, brought on by sleeping in the cold because they couldn't afford firewood. He died just before Christmas. Colt's hands clenched on the table. The mother sold the land to Marcus for barely enough to pay for the funeral and passage back east. Clara thought of her own recent struggles, of the weight of responsibility that had settled on her shoulders after Thomas's death. The difference was that she'd had neighbors who offered help, a community that rallied around those in need. The German family Colt described had faced their crisis alone, systematically isolated by the very people who should have helped. That's when you decided to leave. That's when I realized I wasn't any different from Marcus. I just told myself prettier stories about my motivations. Colt met her eyes directly. I won't lie to you, Clara. Staying here, Fighting Marcus, it's as much about my own guilt as it is about protecting you and the children." The honesty in his admission touched something deep in Clara's chest. Thomas had been a good man, but he'd always tried to shield her from the harder truths of their situation. Colt's willingness to show her his flaws felt like a different kind of respect. "Maybe guilt isn't such a bad motivation," she said quietly. "Better than greed or power." "Is it enough, though, when Marcus comes back with more men, when things get dangerous? Will my guilt be enough to keep you and the children safe?" Clara opened the locket again, studying her parents' faces in the lamplight. Her mother had faced epidemic disease, economic hardship, and the death of the man she loved, all while raising 3 children alone. Her father had worked himself into an early grave, trying to provide for his family during the worst years Kansas had seen. Neither of them had been perfect. Neither had possessed unlimited courage or wisdom. But they'd faced their troubles together, and they'd chosen to keep fighting for what mattered most. "I don't know," Clara said honestly, "but I know that some fights are worth having, even if you're not sure you can win them." The baby kicked strongly, and Clara smiled despite the serious nature of their conversation. "This little one is going to be born into whatever world we make for them. I'd rather it be a world where good people stand together than one where they run away separately." Colt reached across the table, his hand covering hers where it rested over the locket. His touch was warm, calloused from recent work, steadying in a way that made Clara realize how long it had been since anyone had offered her comfort, rather than requiring it from her. "Then we'd better make sure we're prepared for whatever comes next." Outside, night sounds drifted through the windows, the distant call of a coyote, the rustling of small creatures in the brush, the eternal murmur of the Red River carrying its burden toward the sea. Inside the small cabin, 2 people who'd found each other through chance and choosing sat planning for a future that would demand everything they had to give. The locket gleamed softly in the lamplight, a tangible connection to the kind of love that endured beyond death, beyond hardship, beyond the comfortable lies people told themselves about what they were willing to sacrifice for those they cared about. In her bedroom, Sarah dreamed of stories with happy endings, while Samuel slept with his hand-carved bird clutched against his chest. Neither child could know that the adults in their lives were wagering everything on the hope that courage and love might prove stronger than power and greed. But tomorrow would test that hope in ways none of them were quite prepared to face. The ranch deed lay spread across Clara's kitchen table like a battle map, its edges worn from years of handling, and its legal language dense with the formal phrases that meant everything to bankers and nothing to the people who worked the land it described. Clara traced the property boundaries with her finger, remembering how proud Thomas had been the day they'd signed the papers that made this scrubland officially theirs. 40 acres, she murmured. Not much by some standards, but it's been home for 6 years. Colt studied the document with the attention of someone who understood legal complexities. The mineral rights clause is interesting. It says any discoveries of valuable substances beneath the surface belong to the property owner, not the bank. Thomas insisted on that. Said you never knew what you might find if you dug deep enough. Clara smiled at the memory of her husband's optimism. I thought he was being fanciful. What would we want with rocks and dirt? Sometimes the most valuable things are hidden where you least expect them. Colt's tone was thoughtful as he continued reading. Clara, this deed is actually quite well drafted. Thomas knew what he was doing when he negotiated these terms. Their quiet morning was interrupted by the thunder of approaching horses. Clara felt her stomach clench as she moved to the window, expecting to see Marcus's men returning with reinforcements. Instead, she saw a single rider, accompanied by an elegant carriage, bearing the elaborate crest she now recognized as belonging to the Langston family. Colt, she called quietly, I think your brother has come to call. The man who stepped down from the carriage was unmistakably related to Colt, the same dark hair and strong jawline, the same tall frame but where Colt carried himself with quiet strength. Marcus Langston radiated the kind of confidence that came from never having been denied anything he wanted. His clothes were expensive, Eastern cut, his boots polished to mirror brightness, and his smile held the predatory charm of someone who enjoyed the hunt as much as the kill. Clara gathered the deed and folded it carefully, tucking it into her apron pocket. Whatever Marcus wanted, she wouldn't give him the advantage of seeing how little she actually owned. "Mrs. Thompson, I presume." Marcus swept off his hat as Clara and Colt emerged onto the porch. "Marcus Langston, I believe you've been caring for my wayward brother." "Mr. Langston." Clara kept her voice neutral, but she stepped slightly closer to Colt in a gesture of solidarity that wasn't lost on Marcus. "I do hope Colt hasn't been imposing on your hospitality. He has a tendency to overstay his welcome when he's trying to avoid family responsibilities." The insult was delivered with such casual charm that it took Clara a moment to process its deliberate cruelty. Colt tensed beside her, but Marcus continued before either could respond. "I've come to escort him home, naturally. Our father's condition has worsened, and the family needs to be together during this difficult time." "How convenient," Colt said evenly. "Father's been dying for months, Marcus. Funny how his condition only becomes urgent when you need me for something." Marcus's smile never wavered, but Clara caught the flash of irritation in his eyes. "Family obligations don't wait for convenient timing, brother. Surely even you understand that." "I understand perfectly. What I don't understand is why you felt the need to bring armed men to deliver a family message." Clara noticed the riders then, hanging back near the property line but clearly present. 6 men, all bearing the unmistakable signs of hired guns rather than ranch hands. Her hand moved instinctively to her apron pocket where the deed rested, a tangible reminder of what she stood to lose. "One can never be too careful when traveling with valuable cargo," Marcus said smoothly. "Speaking of which, I should probably mention that I've taken the liberty of settling some of your financial obligations, Mrs. Thompson." Clara felt ice settle in her veins. "I beg your pardon." Marcus reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper with the satisfied air of someone producing a winning hand at cards. "Your mortgage, my dear lady. I purchased it from Banker Morrison this morning. Quite a reasonable price, really, considering the uncertain nature of your ability to pay." The world seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet. The mortgage had been her one anchor, the known enemy she could plan against and fight. Having it suddenly transfer to the hands of the Langston family changed everything. "You had no right," she began, but Marcus cut her off with a raised hand. "On the contrary, I had every right. It's a simple business transaction, perfectly legal and properly documented." Mr. Morrison was quite eager to liquidate what he considered a troublesome asset. Colt stepped forward, his entire posture radiating controlled fury. "What do you want, Marcus?" "What I've always wanted, brother. Family unity. You come home, resume your proper place in the business, and Mrs. Thompson here can continue living on her charming little ranch for as long as she likes. Everyone wins." "And if I refuse?" Marcus's smile turned genuinely predatory. "Well then, I suppose Mrs. Thompson will discover how quickly circumstances can change for someone who can't meet their financial obligations. Foreclosure proceedings can be expeditious when the lender is motivated." Clara found her voice, though it came out steadier than she felt. "Mr. Langston, this is my home, my children's home. Whatever quarrel you have with your brother doesn't involve us." "But you see, my dear lady, it does involve you. The moment you decided to harbor my brother, you made it involve you." Marcus's tone remained conversational, almost friendly. "But I'm not an unreasonable man. I'm offering you a way to keep everything you hold dear. By selling out someone who's done nothing but help us. By encouraging someone to honor his family commitments. Surely you, as a widow with children to protect, understand the importance of family loyalty." The manipulation was so smooth, so reasonable sounding, that Clara almost found herself considering it. Marcus Langston was offering her security, the chance to keep her home and raise her children without the constant fear of financial ruin. All she had to do was convince Colt to abandon his principles and return to a life he'd already rejected. "Mama," Sarah's voice came from the doorway, small and uncertain. "Is everything all right?" The sound of her daughter's voice cut through Clara's momentary wavering like a knife. This was what Marcus's offer would cost teaching her children, that safety came at the price of conscience, that the right choice was always the easy one. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Go back inside with Samuel." But Sarah's presence had shifted something in the dynamic. Marcus's eyes moved to the little girl with calculated interest, and Clara saw him noting details: her age, her obvious affection for Colt, the way she instinctively moved closer to her mother when faced with a stranger. "Beautiful children," Marcus observed. "It would be such a shame if they had to grow up somewhere less comfortable." The threat, veiled but unmistakable, made Clara's blood run cold. But it also clarified something that had been churning in her mind since Marcus's arrival. This wasn't really about Colt's inheritance or family obligations. This was about power, the power to control people through their vulnerabilities, to reshape lives to serve his purposes. "Mr. Langston," Clara said quietly, "I think you should leave now." "Mrs. Thompson, I don't think you fully appreciate." "I appreciate perfectly." Clara's voice carried the kind of steel that had seen her through Thomas's death and 6 months of struggling alone. "You've made your position clear. Now let me make mine equally clear. This is my land, my home, and my family. You have no power here unless I give it to you, and I don't." Marcus's mask of charm slipped slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "You're making a mistake, my dear lady. One that could prove very costly." "Perhaps, but it's my mistake to make." For a long moment, the two groups faced each other in tense silence. Then Marcus replaced his hat and stepped back toward his carriage. "I'll give you 3 days to reconsider, Mrs. Thompson. After that, I'm afraid business obligations will require me to take a more direct approach to this situation." As the carriage pulled away, Clara felt her knees threaten to buckle. Colt's arm came around her shoulders, steadying her, and she allowed herself a moment to lean into his strength. "Clara, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen." "I know." She straightened, drawing on reserves of determination she hadn't known she possessed. "But it has happened, and now we have to deal with it. We could leave, take the children and go somewhere Marcus can't find us." Clara thought of the deed in her pocket, of Thomas's dreams buried in this red dirt, of the life she'd begun to imagine with Colt as part of their small family. Running away doesn't solve anything. It just gives the problem to someone else. Then what do we do? Clara looked at the land stretching around them, the repaired fence, the garden she'd coaxed from stubborn soil, the small cabin that had sheltered them through the hardest year of her life. This place had been built with love and sacrifice and hope. She wouldn't surrender it to fear. "We fight," she said simply, "and we trust that doing the right thing matters more than doing the easy thing." The deed in her pocket seemed to pulse with the weight of generations who had struggled for something better, something worth passing on to their children. Whatever came next, Clara Mae Thompson would face it standing on ground that belonged to her, surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with her, even if the odds against them seemed impossible. That evening, Clara found herself cleaning Thomas's rifle with the kind of methodical attention she usually reserved for important household tasks. The weapon had hung over the mantelpiece for months, more memorial than tool, but Marcus's visit had transformed it back into something with practical purpose. The children watched from the kitchen table where they worked on their lessons, their usual chatter subdued by the tension that had settled over the cabin like storm clouds. Samuel's arithmetic problems lay forgotten while he observed his mother's careful movements, and Sarah had stopped reading aloud from her primer. "Mama," Samuel said quietly, "are the bad men going to make us leave?" Clara looked up from her work, seeing fear in her son's eyes despite his attempt to appear grown-up and brave. At 7, Samuel had already lost his father and learned that the world could take away everything you loved without warning. She wouldn't lie to him about the new threats they faced. "They're going to try," she said honestly, "but wanting something and getting it aren't the same thing." "Papa's rifle won't stop all those men," Samuel observed with the brutal practicality of childhood. "No, it won't, but sometimes the willingness to fight matters more than the odds of winning." Colt appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Clara, we need to talk about practical preparations." Marcus meant what he said about 3 days. Clara set the rifle aside and joined him on the porch, leaving the children to their interrupted studies. The autumn evening was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from distant cabins and the eternal murmur of the Red River. 3 days seemed both too long and not nearly enough time to prepare for whatever Marcus would bring. "Tell me honestly," she said, "what are our chances?" Colt was quiet for a moment, weighing his words. "Against Marcus's hired guns? Not good. He'll bring enough men to overwhelm any resistance, and he'll have the law on his side if anyone questions his methods. But Marcus has a weakness. He's never faced anyone who refused to be intimidated. His whole approach depends on people being more afraid of him than they are committed to what they're fighting for." Clara thought about the confrontation that afternoon, remembering the flash of genuine surprise in Marcus's eyes when she'd refused his offer. He'd expected her to be grateful for his reasonable solution, to see him as a savior rather than a threat. "He doesn't understand us," she realized. "People like us, who don't have anything left to lose." "Exactly. And that gives us an advantage he won't be expecting." They were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, but these riders moved with the unhurried pace of neighbors rather than the deliberate menace of Marcus's men. Clara recognized Doc Henderson's bay mare, followed by 2 other familiar figures from town. "Evening, Clara." Doc Henderson dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose joints had seen too many years of frontier doctoring. "Heard you might be having some trouble." Behind him, Ezra Walsh and his son Danny climbed down from their horses. Ezra owned the neighboring spread to the east, 40 acres of rocky pasture that barely supported his small herd. Danny, barely 18 and serious beyond his years, had been one of Thomas's closest friends before fever took him. "Doc," Ezra. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at their unexpected arrival. "What brings you out this evening?" "Word travels fast in small communities," Ezra said gruffly. "Heard Marcus Langston paid you a visit today. Thought you might appreciate some company." Clara's throat tightened with emotion. These men had their own struggles, their own families to protect. The fact that they'd chosen to involve themselves in her fight touched her more deeply than she could express. "That's kind of you, but I don't want to drag you into something that could bring trouble to your own doorsteps." "Clara," Doc Henderson said gently, "the Langston family has been trouble for small ranchers in this territory for 20 years. Marcus buys up distressed properties, forces out families who've worked the land for generations, and consolidates everything under his control. If we don't stand together now, we'll fall separately later." Danny Walsh stepped forward, his young face set with determination. "Mrs. Thompson, my father lost 2 sections of prime grazing land to Marcus 3 years ago. Legal foreclosure, all proper paperwork, but the circumstances were questionable. We've been waiting for a chance to push back." Clara looked at these men, her neighbors, her community, and felt something shift inside her chest. She'd been thinking of this fight as her burden to bear, her choice to make. But Marcus's influence touched all their lives, threatened everything they'd built in this harsh but beautiful country. "What are you proposing?" "That we make Marcus understand he's not just facing one isolated family anymore," Ezra said. "That whatever he does to you, he'll have to answer for to all of us." Colt had been listening quietly, but now he stepped forward. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your support, but you need to understand what you're volunteering for. Marcus has significant resources and no scruples about using them. This could escalate into something dangerous." "Son," Doc Henderson said with the authority of someone who'd seen frontier violence in all its forms, "we've been dealing with dangerous men since before you were born. Marcus Langston isn't the first powerful bully to try to run roughshod over decent folks, and he won't be the last. But he might be the one we finally stop," Danny added quietly. Clara felt tears prick her eyes as the reality of their offer settled over her. These people were willing to risk everything they'd worked for, everything they'd built, to stand with her against a force that could destroy them all. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll let us help," Ezra replied simply. Say you'll trust your neighbors to be neighbors." Before Clara could respond, sharp pains lanced through her belly, making her gasp and double over. The stress of the day, combined with the physical demands of the past weeks, had finally caught up with her. Colt's arms caught her as her knees buckled, and she heard Doc Henderson's sharp intake of breath. "Inside now," the doctor ordered. "Clara, how long have you been having pains?" "Off and on for days," she admitted as Colt helped her toward the cabin. "But they've gotten stronger since this afternoon." "Mama!" Sarah's frightened voice came from the doorway as the men helped Clara inside. "It's all right, sweetheart," Clara managed, though another contraction made her words tight with pain. "Doc Henderson is here. Everything's going to be fine." But as the doctor began his examination and the men clustered in worried conversation, Clara couldn't help thinking that fine was a relative term. Her baby was coming early. Marcus would return in 3 days with overwhelming force, and she was about to become completely helpless at the moment when her family needed her strength most. Through the cabin windows, the lights of neighboring homesteads twinkled in the darkness like scattered stars. Each light represented a family like hers, people trying to build something good in a world that often rewarded cruelty over kindness. Tomorrow would test whether community and courage could stand against power and greed. Tonight, all Clara could do was hold on to the love surrounding her and trust that sometimes the right choice was also the strong one. Thomas's rifle gleamed in the lamplight, clean and ready, while her mother's locket rested warm against her throat. Past and future converged in this moment of pain and possibility, when everything she'd ever valued hung in the balance. The hidden document emerged from beneath the loose floorboard in Thomas's workshop like a revelation wrapped in oiled cloth. Clara had been searching for his old tools, hoping to find something useful for the coming confrontation, when her foot had caught the edge of the board that had always creaked differently from the others. Doc Henderson had managed to stop her premature labor with bed rest and herbal remedies, but the close call had shaken everyone. As Clara recovered her strength, Colt and the neighbors had been preparing defenses, boarding up windows, and planning fields of fire, as if they were preparing for a siege. Now, staring at the document in her trembling hands, Clara realized that everything they thought they knew about their situation had been incomplete. "Colt," she called, her voice barely steady, "you need to see this." He appeared in the workshop doorway, concern creasing his features. "Clara, you shouldn't be up," Doc said. "Look at this." She held up the papers, her heart racing. "It's Thomas's will, his real will, not the simple one filed with the county clerk." Colt moved closer, reading over her shoulder as Clara unfolded the carefully preserved document. What they found there changed everything. "In addition to the property and improvements detailed in my public will," Clara read aloud, "I leave to my beloved wife Clara Mae all rights, claims, and interests in the mineral deposits discovered beneath the northwest section of our property, as confirmed by geological survey dated March 15, 1881. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of hammering where Ezra and Danny were reinforcing the cabin's defenses. Clara read the passage again, hardly daring to believe what the words seemed to say. "Mineral deposits," Colt repeated slowly. "Clara, what kind of minerals?" She turned the page, finding Thomas's careful documentation of his secret discovery. A geological survey, commissioned at considerable expense, detailed the presence of a significant silver vein running beneath their property. The estimated value, calculated in Thomas's meticulous handwriting, made Clara's knees weak. $50,000, she whispered. "Minimum recoverable value, with potential for much more with proper mining equipment." Colt stared at the papers as if they might disappear if he looked away. "That's why Marcus bought your mortgage. He knew." "But how could he know? Thomas kept this completely secret. I never even suspected." Clara's mind raced back through the past months, remembering conversations and observations she'd dismissed at the time. Marcus's representatives had visited the area several times over the past year, ostensibly checking on Langston holdings. There had been surveyors in the region, men with instruments who claimed to be updating county maps. The geological survey, Colt realized, pointing to the official seal on the document. It wasn't just Thomas who commissioned one. Marcus has been having systematic surveys done throughout the territory, looking for exactly this kind of opportunity. Clara sank onto Thomas's workbench, the magnitude of the revelation overwhelming her. He's been planning this for months, maybe longer. The pressure on our mortgage, the isolation, the way other families have been forced out, it was all to acquire mineral rights. Which means Marcus needs this land specifically. It's not just about getting me back or controlling one more ranch. The silver makes this property genuinely valuable. The implications began cascading through Clara's mind. If the land was truly worth $50,000 or more, then Marcus's threats took on an entirely different character. He wasn't just bullying a poor widow for strategic advantage. He was attempting to steal a fortune through intimidation and legal manipulation. "We have to tell the others," Clara said, struggling to her feet despite the doctor's orders for continued rest. They found the men clustered around the kitchen table, studying crude maps of the property and discussing defensive positions. The conversation stopped when Clara appeared with the hidden will in her hands. "Gentlemen," she announced, "we need to revise our understanding of what we're fighting for." Doc Henderson looked up sharply. "Clara, you should be resting. The baby will be fine, and so will I. But first, you all need to see this." She spread Thomas's secret will across the table, watching as the men absorbed the information it contained. Ezra let out a low whistle when he reached the valuation figures, while Danny stared at the survey map as if it were written in a foreign language. "Well, I'll be damned," Doc Henderson said finally. "Thomas was sitting on a fortune and never said a word. He was protecting it." Clara realized. He knew that knowledge like this would make us targets. As long as everyone thought we were just another struggling ranch family, we were relatively safe. "But Marcus figured it out anyway," Colt observed grimly. "Which changes our position considerably," Ezra said thoughtfully. "Clara, with proper legal representation, you could fight Marcus's foreclosure attempt. This kind of wealth gives you resources you didn't have before." Clara studied the men around her table, good, honest people who had risked their own safety to stand with her against seemingly impossible odds. The discovery of Thomas's secret changed the practical aspects of their situation, but it didn't change the fundamental question they faced. "Resources don't matter if Marcus kills us before we can use them," she pointed out. "He's still coming tomorrow with enough men to overwhelm any resistance we can mount." "But now we know why he's coming," Danny said quietly. "And we know he can't afford to simply drive you off the land. He needs legal control of the mineral rights, which means he needs you to surrender voluntarily or die with proper documentation." Colt had been studying the survey map with growing excitement. "Clara, look at this. The silver vein doesn't stop at your property line. According to this survey, it extends east onto Ezra's land and west toward the river." Ezra leaned over the map, tracing the indicated mineral formation with his finger. "That section along my northwest boundary where nothing grows properly, I always wondered why the soil was different there. If the vein is as extensive as this suggests," Doc Henderson said slowly, "we're not talking about one family's fortune. We're talking about enough wealth to transform this entire region." The room fell silent as the full implications settled over them. Marcus wasn't just trying to steal Clara's inheritance. He was attempting to monopolize mineral wealth that could belong to multiple families, wealth that could lift the entire community out of the poverty and uncertainty that made them vulnerable to his manipulations. "This is bigger than any of us realized," Clara said quietly. "Thomas discovered something that could change everything for everyone in this area." "Which is exactly why Marcus can't be allowed to succeed," Colt said with quiet intensity. "If he gains control of this resource through intimidation and fraud, he'll use the same methods to take whatever else he wants. But if we stand together, if we prove that communities can resist this kind of exploitation, we become an example," Ezra finished. "Other communities, other families facing similar pressures would know it's possible to fight back and win." Clara looked around the table at these men who had become more than neighbors, more than allies. They had become the foundation of something larger than any individual's struggling community, willing to stand for principles that transcended immediate self-interest. "Then we'd better make sure we win," she said simply. Outside, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their planning. But these weren't Marcus's men returning early. The rhythm was different, more urgent. Danny moved to the window and peered through the boards they'd nailed across the glass. "Riders coming fast from town," he reported. "Looks like Sheriff Hawkins and somebody else." Clara felt her stomach clench. Sheriff Hawkins had always been fair but cautious, reluctant to involve himself in disputes between powerful interests and ordinary citizens. His arrival could mean anything from reinforcement to betrayal. The knock that came at the door was firm but respectful. "Mrs. Thompson, Sheriff Hawkins. I need to speak with you about a legal matter." Clara exchanged glances with Colt before moving to answer the door. Whatever news the sheriff brought, they would face it together, armed now with knowledge that transformed their desperate stand into something with the potential for genuine victory. The hidden will lay spread across the table like a map to a future none of them had dared imagine. Tomorrow's confrontation would determine whether that future belonged to Marcus Langston's empire or to the community that had chosen to fight for it. Colt's father's pocket watch ticked with mechanical precision in the pre-dawn silence, its steady rhythm marking the passage of time toward Marcus's promised return. Clara held the timepiece carefully, its weight substantial in her palm, remembering how Colt had explained its significance the night before. "3 generations of Langston men have carried this watch," he told her as they'd prepared for what might be their final night together. "My grandfather used it to time cattle drives, my father to schedule business meetings, and I was supposed to use it to build an empire. Instead, I'm using it to count down to the end of everything my family represents." Sheriff Hawkins had brought unexpected news the previous evening. A federal marshal was investigating Marcus's business practices, following complaints from families across 3 territories who had lost their land under suspicious circumstances. The marshal was en route, but wouldn't arrive for another 2 days too late to prevent whatever Marcus planned for this morning. "Time's running out for all of us," Clara murmured, watching the watch hands crawl towards 7 o'clock, the hour Marcus had specified for his return. The cabin had been transformed overnight into something resembling a fortress. Ezra and Danny had boarded up most of the windows, leaving only narrow firing slots. Doc Henderson had prepared medical supplies in the back room, while Colt had checked and rechecked their meager arsenal of weapons. But Clara's greatest concern wasn't for the battle to come. It was for her children, who sat at the kitchen table trying to eat breakfast with the forced normalcy of children who understood that adults were preparing for something terrible. "Mama," Sarah said quietly, "if something happens to you, what will happen to us?" The question cut through Clara's heart like a blade. She'd been so focused on fighting for their future that she hadn't adequately prepared for the possibility that she might not be part of it. "Nothing's going to happen to me, sweetheart. But if it did..." Clara paused, choosing her words carefully. "Doc Henderson has promised to look after you, and Ezra's wife has said you could stay with their family as long as needed." "But we want to stay here," Samuel said, with the stubborn determination that reminded Clara so much of his father. "This is our home. And it always will be, no matter what happens today." Clara moved to her children, kneeling beside their chairs and pulling them close. But sometimes keeping something means being willing to leave it temporarily. She felt the baby stir restlessly in her womb, responding to her elevated pulse and the tension that filled the cabin like smoke. The contractions had stopped, but Doc Henderson warned that stress could bring them back at any moment. "Clara," Colt called from the window where he'd been watching the road. Movement on the horizon. She rose carefully, her hand pressed to her belly, and joined him at the narrow gap between boards. In the distance, dust clouds marked the approach of multiple riders. Even from far away, their formation spoke of disciplined men with a specific purpose. "How many?" she asked. 8, maybe 10. More than we expected, but not overwhelming. Clara studied Colt's profile as he watched the approaching threat. Over the past weeks, she'd seen him transform from a wealthy man's son playing at ranch work into someone genuinely committed to defending what mattered. The change wasn't just in his actions, but in his bearing, the way he stood, the certainty in his voice, the complete absence of the doubt that had marked his early days with them. "Are you ready for this?" she asked quietly. He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the same question. "Are any of us, but ready or not, it's here." The sound of horses grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of harness and the low voices of men discussing tactics. Clara moved away from the window and gathered her children, leading them to the back room, where Doc Henderson waited with his medical supplies. "I want you both to stay here with Doc," she told them firmly. "No matter what you hear, no matter how long it takes, you don't come out until one of us comes to get you. Do you understand?" Both children nodded solemnly, but Clara saw the fear in their eyes. Sarah clutched her rag doll while Samuel held the wooden bird he'd carved under Colt's guidance. They were too young for this kind of terror, too innocent to understand the adult world of greed and violence that had invaded their peaceful home. "Mama," Sarah whispered, "will you come back?" Clara knelt again, fighting back tears that would only frighten her children more. "I'm going to do everything in my power to come back to you. But whatever happens, I want you to remember that you are loved, that you are strong, and that this land will always be yours." She kissed both children and left them in Doc Henderson's capable hands, returning to the main room where Colt and Ezra were making final preparations. Danny had positioned himself at the front window, Thomas's rifle ready in his hands. "They've stopped," Danny reported, "about 100 yards out, just beyond effective range." Clara moved to her own position behind the kitchen table, which they'd turned on its side to create a makeshift barrier. From here, she could see the front door and one window while remaining relatively protected from return fire. "Remember," Colt said quietly, "Marcus wants this to look legal. He'll try to serve foreclosure papers first, make it seem like we're the ones escalating to violence. And if we refuse his papers, then the pretense ends and we find out what kind of men we're really dealing with." The wait stretched into minutes that felt like hours. Clara could hear voices outside, Marcus giving orders to his men, but couldn't make out specific words. The pocket watch in her apron seemed to tick louder with each passing second. Then Marcus's voice rose clearly above the others. "Mrs. Thompson, I've come to serve legal papers regarding your property. Please step outside so we can conduct this business properly." Clara and Colt exchanged glances. This was the moment of choice, the point where they could still surrender, accept Marcus's terms, and avoid bloodshed. All Clara had to do was walk outside, sign whatever papers Marcus presented, and her children would be safe. She thought of Thomas's hidden will, still spread across their kitchen table. She thought of the silver beneath their feet, the wealth that could transform not just their lives, but the lives of everyone in their community. She thought of the German family Colt had described, driven from their land by the same kind of legal manipulation Marcus was attempting now. "Mrs. Thompson," Marcus called again, "I'm trying to conduct this business in a civilized manner. Don't force me to pursue less pleasant alternatives." Clara stood slowly, her hand resting on her belly, where new life grew despite the violence surrounding them. She moved to the door but didn't open it. "Mr. Langston," she called back, "I'm afraid I'm not interested in any business you might have to conduct. I suggest you remove yourself from my property." The silence that followed stretched taut with possibility. Then Marcus's laughter carried across the yard, cold and genuinely amused. "Mrs. Thompson, I had hoped we could handle this like civilized people, but if you insist on being difficult," his voice hardened. "Boys, it appears Mrs. Thompson is refusing to accept legal service of documents. I'm afraid we'll have to enter the premises to ensure proper delivery." Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the true nature of their situation crystallized. Marcus had brought enough men and enough legal pretense to justify whatever violence followed. In the eyes of any future investigation, He would be the legitimate creditor trying to serve papers on a resistant debtor. "Colt," she whispered. "He's going to." "I know." His voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Clara, there's something I need to tell you before this starts." "What?" "Whatever happens here today, these past weeks with you and the children have been the most meaningful of my life. You've shown me what it means to fight for something worth having instead of running from something I didn't want." Clara felt tears threaten despite her determination to remain strong. "Colt, and if we don't survive this, I want you to know that loving you has made me a better man than I ever thought I could be." Before Clara could respond, the sound of splintering wood announced that Marcus's patience had ended. The siege of the Thompson Ranch had begun, and with it, the final test of whether love and community could triumph over power and greed. The pocket watch ticked steadily in Clara's apron, marking time that seemed both infinite and desperately short. Outside, men with guns advanced on her home, while inside, everything she'd ever valued prepared to make its final stand. The Red River ferry bell rang out across the morning air with urgent, rhythmic clanging that cut through the tension like a call to battle. Clara's heart leaped as she recognized the signal Doc Henderson had arranged with the ferryman to ring the bell if more help arrived from town. "That's not just the ferry," Danny called from his position at the window. "Look toward the road." Through the gaps in their makeshift fortifications, Clara could see dust clouds rising from multiple directions. Riders were approaching from the east and south, converging on the Thompson Ranch with purpose that made Marcus's men shift nervously in their positions. "How many?" Colt asked, his rifle trained on the nearest of Marcus's gunmen. "Hard to tell from here, but it looks like half the county's coming." Danny's voice carried amazement and something approaching relief. Marcus himself had taken cover behind his carriage, but his voice carried clearly across the yard. "Mrs. Thompson, call off your friends, or this situation will become very unpleasant for everyone involved." Clara moved to the broken window, keeping low, but making sure her voice would carry. "Mr. Langston, these people don't answer to me. They're here because they believe in standing up to bullies." The first group of riders crested the hill, and Clara recognized faces from town shopkeepers, farmers, even the blacksmith with his massive frame and determined expression. Behind them came more riders, families she knew from church, neighbors from homesteads scattered across the territory. "Jesus," one of Marcus's men muttered loud enough to be heard. "Boss, that's got to be 30 people coming up that road." 43, actually," called a familiar voice from the approaching group. Sheriff Hawkins rode at the head of the first wave, his badge gleaming in the morning sun. "And I've got legal papers of my own to serve, Mr. Langston." Marcus emerged from behind his carriage, his composure finally showing cracks. "Sheriff, this is a private matter. I'm attempting to serve foreclosure papers on a delinquent debtor." "Funny thing about that," Sheriff Hawkins replied, dismounting but keeping his hand near his weapon. "Got a telegram from the territorial capital this morning. Seems there's been some irregularities in how certain properties have been acquired lately. Federal Marshal's office has suspended all foreclosure proceedings involving Langston Holdings pending investigation." Clara felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. The community support was overwhelming, but having legal backing transformed everything. Marcus could intimidate individuals, but he couldn't fight the federal government. "That's impossible," Marcus snarled. "Those proceedings are perfectly legal." "Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. That's for the marshal to determine. But until he does, nobody's getting foreclosed on today." The momentum had shifted completely. Marcus's gunmen found themselves surrounded by armed citizens, outnumbered 4-1 by people with intimate knowledge of the local terrain. What had begun as an intimidation campaign had become a standoff Marcus couldn't win. But Clara knew from Colt's stories that Marcus Langston had never accepted defeat gracefully. "This isn't over," Marcus called toward the cabin, his voice carrying frustrated rage. "You think this changes anything? I have resources you can't imagine, influence that reaches." His words were cut off by another contraction that doubled Clara over, without warning. The stress of the confrontation, combined with her advanced pregnancy, had finally overwhelmed her body's ability to cope. "Clara!" Colt was beside her instantly, his rifle forgotten as he caught her before she could fall. "The baby!" she gasped. "It's coming now." In the chaos that followed, the standoff dissolved into a different kind of emergency. Doc Henderson emerged from the back room, shouting orders for hot water and clean cloths. The armed citizens maintained their positions around Marcus's men, but the immediate focus shifted to the woman who had become the symbol of their collective resistance. "Get her to the bedroom," Doc Henderson commanded. "Ezra, keep those men covered, but don't start anything unless they do. Colt, I need you to—" "I'm not leaving her," Colt said firmly, supporting Clara as another contraction gripped her. "Then help me get her comfortable, and do exactly what I tell you." As Clara was helped toward the bedroom, she could see through the window that Marcus was arguing furiously with Sheriff Hawkins. His careful plans had unraveled completely, but she could see in his posture that he was already calculating new approaches, new pressures he could bring to bear. "He's not going to give up," she managed between contractions. "Let him try," Colt said grimly. "The whole territory knows what happened here today. He can't use the same tactics again." But even as he spoke, Clara saw Marcus mounting his horse with the deliberate movements of someone who had already decided on his next course of action. Whatever defeat he'd suffered here was temporary in his mind, just another obstacle to overcome through superior resources and ruthless determination. The ferry bell continued its triumphant ringing as Clara was helped into the bedroom where she would bring new life into a world that had just proven itself capable of surprising acts of courage and community. Outside, 43 armed citizens maintained their vigil, sending a message that would echo across the territory. Some things were too important to surrender without a fight. The first blanket to wrap Clara's newborn daughter was soft yellow cotton, hand-stitched by the women of the community who had somehow known this day would come. As Doc Henderson placed the tiny, perfect child in Clara's arms, the sound of celebration from outside the cabin mixed with the baby's first cries in a symphony of hope and new beginnings. "She's beautiful," Colt whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he gazed down at the infant who had chosen this moment of triumph to enter the world. "What will you name her?" Clara studied her daughter's face, seeing traces of Thomas in the shape of her nose and something entirely new in the determined set of her tiny mouth. This child had been born into conflict, but surrounded by community, carried through danger by people who had chosen to stand together. "Hope," she said simply. "Her name is Hope." Through the bedroom window, they could see the aftermath of Marcus's defeat. Sheriff Hawkins was taking statements from witnesses, while the armed citizens from town maintained their protective circle around the property. Marcus himself had retreated with his men, but not before making it clear that this was merely the first round of a longer battle. "Mama?" Sarah's small voice came from the doorway, where she stood with Samuel, both children wide-eyed, at the sight of their new sister. "Come meet your sister," Clara said softly, making room on the bed for the twins to get their first close look at Hope. Samuel approached with the careful reverence of someone handling something precious and fragile. "She's so small. Will she be able to help with the chores?" Clara laughed, despite her exhaustion. "Not for a while yet, sweetheart, but someday she'll be running around this ranch just like you and Sarah. If we still have the ranch," Sarah added with the practical pessimism that had developed during their months of struggle. "We'll have the ranch," Colt said firmly. "Marcus may not give up easily, but he's lost his advantage. The whole territory knows what he tried to do here, and the federal marshal will ensure justice is done." Doc Henderson finished cleaning up his medical supplies, his weathered face showing satisfaction at both the successful birth and the day's larger victory. That baby couldn't have picked a better day to arrive, born into freedom, surrounded by people who fought for her right to be here. A knock at the cabin door interrupted their quiet celebration. Sheriff Hawkins appeared, hat in hand, his expression mixing official business with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Thompson, I hate to intrude, but I wanted you to know that Marcus has withdrawn for now. He's heading back to his ranch, but he made some threats about this not being over." Clara adjusted Hope's blanket, thinking about the future her daughter would inherit. What kind of threats? Legal challenges, mostly. Claims he'll tie up the mineral rights in court for years, make it impossible for you to develop the silver deposits profitably. Sheriff Hawkins paused. "But between you and me, I think his real power was in operating from the shadows. Now that everyone knows his methods, he'll find it harder to intimidate people." "And the federal investigation?" "That's real enough. Marshall's due here tomorrow, and he's already collected testimony from a dozen families across 3 territories. Marcus's empire was built on shaky legal ground, and it's starting to crumble." Colt had been listening quietly, but now he spoke with the authority of someone who had made a final decision. "Sheriff, I want to make a formal statement about my family's business practices. Everything I know about Marcus's methods, every detail about how the Langston empire operates." "Son, that's a serious step. Testifying against your own family." "They stopped being my family the day they chose power over principle," Colt said firmly. "My family is here now, in this room, with people who believe in doing what's right, regardless of the cost." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she understood the full magnitude of what Colt was offering. Testifying against Marcus wouldn't just help her case. It would provide the evidence needed to bring down the entire network of corruption and intimidation that had terrorized small ranchers across the territory. "There's something else," Sheriff Hawkins added. "The folks from town, they've been talking. Word of what happened here today has spread fast, and people are organizing. They're calling it the Red River Alliance, families and communities pledging to stand together against this kind of exploitation." Hope stirred in Clara's arms, making the soft sounds of a newborn, adjusting to a world full of voices and warmth. Clara looked down at her daughter and felt a profound sense of completion. This child would grow up in a community that had proven itself capable of protecting what mattered most. "Sheriff," Clara said quietly, "please tell the people outside that I'm grateful. More grateful than I can express. They didn't have to get involved in our fight, but they chose to anyway." "Ma'am, I think you're misunderstanding something. This wasn't your fight that we joined. This was our fight, and you were brave enough to make the first stand." After the sheriff left, the cabin settled into peaceful quiet. The crowds outside had dispersed, returning to their own homes and families with the satisfaction of a job well done. Ezra and Danny remained on watch, but the immediate danger had passed. Clara dozed fitfully, Hope sleeping against her chest, while Colt sat vigil beside the bed. The events of the day seemed dreamlike now. The confrontation, the arrival of community support, the birth of her daughter, in the midst of it all. "Colt," she said softly, not wanting to wake the baby, but needing to voice the thought that had been growing in her mind. "Yes? When you testify against Marcus, it's going to make you a target. He'll never forgive you for destroying everything he's worked for." Colt was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "Probably not. But Clara, I've been running from who I was supposed to be my entire adult life. For the first time, I know exactly who I want to be, and that's the man who helps raise this little girl in a world where justice matters more than power." Hope made a small sound in her sleep, one tiny hand curling around Clara's finger with surprising strength. This child, born into struggle but surrounded by love, would inherit not just the silver beneath their land, but something far more valuable, a community that had proven itself willing to fight for what was right. Outside, the Red River continued its eternal flow toward the Gulf, carrying away the debris of old conflicts and bringing the promise of new beginnings. The ferry bell had fallen silent, its message delivered, but the echo of its ringing would resonate through the territory for years to come. In a small cabin on 40 acres of hard-won land, a family forged by choice rather than blood settled into their first night together, while underground, veins of silver waited to transform their humble homestead into something that could sustain generations of hope. 6 months later, on a crisp spring morning when the Red River ran clear and strong, Clara Mae Langston stood on the porch of her expanded cabin, watching her husband teach Samuel and Sarah how to properly care for the new horses they'd purchased with the first profits from the silver mine. The wedding rings that adorned her finger caught the morning light simple gold bands that Colt had commissioned from the town jeweler, inscribed with the date they'd chosen to officially join their lives together. The ceremony had been small but perfect. Held in the garden Clara had expanded with the help of neighbors who had become family. Hope gurgled contentedly in her arms, now a robust 6-month-old with her father's dark eyes and her mother's determined chin. The baby had thrived in the months since her dramatic arrival, growing strong in a household where laughter had replaced fear and abundance had replaced desperate want. "Mama, look!" Sarah called from the paddock, where she sat atop a gentle mare under Colt's careful supervision. "I can trot by myself now." Clara waved back, marveling at how much had changed since that stormy day when she'd pulled a drowning stranger from the river. The shy, worried little girl who had helped rescue Colt had bloomed into a confident child who approached each day with enthusiasm and courage. Samuel, too, had transformed. The weight of premature responsibility had lifted from his 7-year-old shoulders, replaced by the normal concerns of childhood learning to ride, helping with ranch work that was now play rather than survival, and pestering his new father with endless questions about everything from astronomy to animal husbandry. The mine itself operated in the northwest section of their property, its modest but steady output providing more than enough income to support not just their family but several of their neighbors who had invested in the operation. True to the Geological Survey's predictions, the silver vein had proved extensive and rich, but Clara and Colt had been careful to develop it sustainably, ensuring that the land would remain productive for generations. "Mrs. Langston?" Ezra Walsh approached from the direction of his own property, where similar mining operations had begun under the cooperative agreement the Red River Alliance had negotiated. "Got word from town that the marshal's finally ready to announce his findings." Clara felt a familiar tightness in her chest at the mention of the federal investigation that had consumed the past 6 months. Marcus had fought the charges with expensive lawyers and political connections, but Colt's testimony had provided the cornerstone evidence needed to build a comprehensive case. "What's the verdict?" 5 years in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy. His entire operations being disbanded, properties sold at auction to compensate his victims. Ezra's weathered face showed satisfaction. "Justice may be slow, ma'am, but it's thorough when it finally arrives." Clara nodded, feeling a complex mixture of relief and sadness. Marcus had brought his punishment on himself through years of predatory behavior, but she couldn't entirely forget that he was Colt's brother, the last link to a family legacy that was now completely severed. "How is Colt taking the news?" "Hard to say. He's been expecting it, but knowing something's coming and actually hearing it are different things." Clara looked toward the paddock, where her husband was patiently adjusting Sarah's posture in the saddle. Colt had transformed as much as any of them over the past months, growing into the role of father and husband with the same quiet determination he'd shown when fighting for their land. But she knew the weight of testifying against his own family still troubled him in quiet moments. Hope began to fuss, and Clara adjusted her position, offering the comfort of movement and maternal warmth. This child would grow up never knowing want or fear, surrounded by siblings who adored her and parents who had chosen each other through trial and triumph. "Ezra, would you tell Colt that the marshal's announcement came through? I think he should hear it from me." After Ezra left, Clara remained on the porch, watching her family and thinking about the strange currents of fate that had brought them together. A desperate act of mercy during a flood had grown into a love story that transformed not just 2 lives but an entire community. The Red River Alliance had become a model for other regions, proving that small communities could organize effectively against corporate intimidation. Families across the territory had found new courage to resist exploitation, knowing they weren't fighting alone. When Colt finally approached the porch, his expression showed he'd already heard the news about Marcus. He climbed the steps slowly, settling beside Clara on the wooden bench they'd built together during the early days of their marriage. "It's really over," he said quietly. "The legal part is over, but Colt, the important part, what we've built here, what we've become, that's just beginning." He was quiet for a moment, studying the faces of the children who had become his own through love rather than blood. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been at the river that day. If you decided it was too dangerous to help a stranger." Clara shifted hope to her other arm, considering the question she'd asked herself many times. "I think we would have found each other somehow. People who are meant to be together have a way of recognizing each other, even in the most unlikely circumstances." "Do you ever regret it, choosing the difficult path instead of accepting Marcus's offer?" Clara looked at their expanded ranch, at the children who ran and played without fear, at the husband who had become her true partner in every sense of the word. The silver mine hummed quietly in the distance, providing security without defining their worth. Neighbors dropped by regularly, not as supplicants seeking help, but as friends sharing in community. "Never," she said firmly. "Some choices are worth whatever they cost." Hope had fallen asleep against her shoulder, peaceful and secure, in a world where courage and love had proved stronger than power and greed. The baby's tiny fist clutched at Clara's dress, holding on with the instinctive determination that had already marked her as her mother's daughter. As the sun climbed higher, painting the Red River Valley in shades of gold and green, Clara Mae Langston sat surrounded by the family she'd fought to protect and the love she'd been brave enough to choose. The water that had nearly claimed Colt's life had become the source of their greatest blessings, proving that sometimes the most dangerous currents carried the most precious cargo. In the distance, the ferry bell chimed the hour, its notes carrying across the valley like a hymn of gratitude for second chances and the courage to seize them. The sound echoed from the bluffs and returned, transformed, just as their lives had been transformed by a single act of mercy on a storm-tossed day when everything seemed lost. But nothing was ever truly lost, Clara had learned, as long as people were willing to fight for what mattered most. Love, family, community, justice, these things endured beyond any individual struggle, passing from one generation to the next, like silver hidden in the earth, waiting for the right moment to emerge and change everything. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility and grounded in the kind of love that could weather any storm. And at the heart of it all was the simple truth that had guided Clara from the beginning. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is reach out to help a drowning stranger, not knowing that in saving them, you might save yourself.